Hello and welcome to today's ASI Donman webcast on Visual Reporter Basics. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Marla Nelson and I'm the Marketing Specialist here at ASI Asia Pacific. Our webcast today will run for under 1 hour, so we'll be finishing at or before 3 o'clock Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. Now before we get started, I'll run through some housekeeping matters and ensure we're all up to speed with using the GoToWebinar system. So on the front middle of your screen, you'll see the first slide of the presentation, and then on the right, there's a control panel. You can minimize the control panel down to a toolbar by clicking on the orange Grab tab arrow, and this will allow you to view the presentation in full screen. You can then click on that arrow to bring back the control panel when you need to. Now, everybody has been muted upon entry today to allow for clear audio, and we won't be opening up the lines, but we do welcome your questions and comments, so I'll explain how you can interact with us today. So you can post your questions or comments at any time by using the question pane in the control panel. Just type your question or comment in the box provided and then click on the send button. We will address questions and share any comments at the end of the main presentation. And of course, if you're having any technical difficulties with GoToWebinar, you can use that question pane and talk to me directly, and I'll do my best to assist you. All right, it's now my pleasure to introduce our presenters today. On the line is Gary Lincoln and Murray Neal. Gary and Murray are both Senior Tech Support Analysts here at ASI Asia Pacific, and they will be taking you through today's topic on Visual Reporter Basics. So I will now hand over to Murray to get started. Thanks, Murray.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. As Marla has said, we're going to be looking at Visual Reporter and just some of the basic things that we can do with that. I'll be showing you how to set up a fairly simple report and some of the things we can do with that, and then I'll hand over to Gary, who will take you through some more options that we can use when creating these reports. Next month's webinar, Gary will actually take you through some of the more advanced features that Visrep has to perhaps increase the ability that you have to produce better reports. So if you do get a chance to actually use Visrep between now and then, that will be great, so that you'll then be able to build on that with Gary. Now, learning to use Visrep is a little bit like learning to drive a car. Once you know how to drive a car, that's great for getting around the local area, but if you need to drive to Sydney, you need a map or a GPS. And that's the same very much so with Visual Reporter as well. You can learn how to use Visual Reporter, but you still need to understand the underlying data, i.e., where's the data that I want and which particular fields from that data do I want to actually output into my report. Visrep is actually the latest of a series of reporter or generic reporting tools that Donman has offered, and you may in fact find some of those already or still on your menu. But this one is probably the best one. It's the one that we have actually written completely ourselves rather than modified other people's ones. Now, essentially there are 4 basic steps to producing a report in Visrep. The first of those is to select the file. That's going to be the file that's got the basic information that you want. So that could be your donor file if you want information about your donors, or the donation file if you're looking at information about donations. There are pledges, campaign. In fact, any file that's in Donman, you can actually run a report on. But as I mentioned before, you need to know which file you're looking at. However, for basic things, there's probably only going to be 3 or 4 files that you'll deal with. That would be the donor file, the donation file, the campaign file, and probably the pledge file. Once you've actually selected the file that you want to use, the next thing you need to do is choose the output order. So do you want it to come out in alphabetical order, or maybe in donor number order, or date order, or something like that? Now, if you're going to actually extract this and put it into Excel, it probably doesn't matter that much, but sometimes the output order can actually make it more efficient, that it, instead of running through all of your data, it just looks at data within perhaps a specified period of time. Once you've chosen the output order, the next step is to actually select which particular records from that file that you want. Do you just want your individual donors, or do you want donors who've given you more than $1,000 in total? That sort of selection criteria is then used for running that report just to get the people or the records that you want from that file. And finally, the last thing is, once you've selected the records that you want, out of that, for each of those records, which particular bits of information or fields do you actually want to include in your output. Now, of course, with some files like the donor file, you've probably got 200 or 300 fields, and you don't want to be outputting that, especially if you're trying to print it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually get into Visual Reporter and have a look at how to do that. So I'm going to start at the Start menu. So how do we get into Visual Reporter? Well, we go across first of all to our Reports menu, and then down the side here, we've got this Reporter submenu. And in my case here, I've actually got those three options there, but Visual Reporter is the one that we're looking at. The old Reporter and the Reporter Simplified are just two of the old generic reporting tools. Now, on your menu, it might not say Visual Reporter, it might say Visual Report Writer, or it might just say Visrep. They're all the same, it'll run the same program, so no matter which of those you have, just select it. Now, when you first start using Visrep, you'll probably find that the wizard will pop up, and you can see here that the wizard has popped up in my case. And it's probably a good way to start because it effectively holds your hand and takes you along the path to building that report. However, once you are a little bit more familiar with it, you might decide you don't want that. So you can cancel it at any time, or if you don't want it to ever appear unless you ask it, under Options and then Settings, you can untick the Run Wizard at Startup. And then if I escape from here and then go back in, it doesn't pop up. However, I can still run it by clicking on Wizard. So for those of you that haven't really used Visrep much, this is probably how it'll be presented to you. So as I mentioned, the first step that we're going to look at is which file do we want? So for my simple report, I'm actually going to use the donor file because probably 50% of your reports are going to be on the donor file. So that's the probably most common one. So I'm going to pick the donor file and then I go next. So here we have the option now to change the sort order. Now, there are certain indexes that are automatically maintained by the system, and these are what we're seeing down here. So I can do this in, say, donor number order. I can do it maybe in postcode order or any of these things here. I can actually select. Now, there is an option at the bottom to create your own index, and Gary will take you through that after I've finished. So I'm just going to take the donor number. I do have the option to do it in reverse, but I'm not going to worry about that. So the next option here is where I can add a criteria. Now, for this particular report, I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. So I'm going to say I want every single donor record on file, of which there's something like 11,000. So I'm not going to put any criterion in there at all. I'm going to go next. And so I'm now at the last step where I want to output or tell it which fields to output from my file. So I'm going to start with donor number. Now, there's a couple of ways of doing this. I can tick the box, and I can tick the ones that I want, and then I can click on Add. What I actually prefer to do is double-click them, because if I do this and go, I want title, first name, surname, and then I click on Add, you'll notice that they haven't actually come out in the order that I ticked them. They come out in the order that they appear within the file. I'll just remove those. If I double-click them, it now appears, and then I go title, first name, surname, and so I'm actually getting them in the order that I'm specifying them, and I find that a much more useful way to do it. I'm going to take a few other things. Now, this is at the moment in the order that they do appear in the file. By clicking on field name at the top, that has now sorted that alphabetically. So I'm going to go down. I want to take the donor type. So I want to know whether they're an individual, a company, a club, or anything like that. I'll take the company name in case it is a corporate type record. And I want to know how much money these people have given overall. So on the second donor screen, there is a number of fields there which includes their overall total donation, and maybe I'll take their donation count as well. So now that I've specified the fields that I want in my report, I simply go next, and then I go finish, and there's my report. So all very simple. In the case of the company, I can stretch that across a bit because it wasn't quite enough room there. But now you can see all the bits of information in the order that I chose. So this is one page that I can scroll through. But if I look at my page list here, as you can see, there was 150 pages. Now I'll just maximize that. So I'm not sure why that says 0, but it's found 11,208 records there. Now, a lot of these are just small donors. Maybe we don't want those. Maybe we only want people that have given, let's say, over $1,000. So I can actually go back now to my data tab and add that criterion in there. So if I click on this, I get a new line here. If I click on donors.recnum, which is an internal number that's of really no consequence to you, from here, I can again pick the fields that I want. So what I want to do is I want to tell it that I only want people where their donation total is greater than or equal to $1,000. So I've selected the donor's donation total as the field. I don't want equals, so in my comparisons here, you can see I can compare that value to anything I put in here. So in this case, because I want donors where their donation total overall is greater than or equal to $1,000, that's what I choose as my comparison, greater than or equal. And the value field, I don't need the dollar symbol, I just put 1,000. And having done that, I can simply go back to my preview, and now you can see that the only ones that are selected are greater than $1,000. And if I look at my page count, I've now been reduced down to 11 pages. Okay, so that was fairly straightforward. Let's suppose I'm only interested in individuals who have given more than $1,000. So again, I can come back here, I can add a new criterion, again where it's got donors.recnum. I can choose donor type. This time I'm going to say equals. Now I know that the donor type for individuals was I, and we could actually see that on that previous report. But when I click in here, if I'm not really sure what I'm after, I can click on this question mark here, and it will run through all 11,000 records in my donor file, and it gives me a breakdown of what values go in there. So here I can see that 9,900 of those records have a donor type of I, so I can simply choose that. And when I go to my preview, now you can see that the donor type is all I. And of course, again, they're all greater than $1,000. We can add another criterion as well. So let's say we didn't just want the donor type of I, but we also wanted the corporate ones. Now, if I click on new criterion again and go to donor type, if I say equals C here, because I know that that's corporate, when I go to my preview, I get nothing. Now, the reason for that is it's going to pick records where the donation total is greater than or equal to $1,000, and the donor type is equal to an I, and the donor type is equal to C. Well, clearly, the donor type can't be equal to both I and C. So what I actually should have done there is I should have said or. So I want to pick anyone where the donation total is greater than $1,000 and the donor type is equal to I or it's equal to C. Now down on this line here, you can see it's basically put all of those criteria together in a little bit more English-like statement. And because it's got the brackets, and there is an option for automatically bracketing these things, where you've got two ors together, it will typically bracket those. So what it's going to do, when it looks at each record, it's first of all going to evaluate whether the donor type is equal to I or it's equal to C. If either of those is true, it then will check to see if it's also greater than or equal to $1,000 for the donation total. So now when I go to my preview, you can see I've got C's and I, and again, they're all greater than $1,000. Now, let's suppose I say, well, yeah, that's great, but I only want the corporate donors if they're more than $10,000. So you might go, okay, let me add another criterion here. I'm going to say donation total. And again, I'll say greater than or equal to $10,000. Now, if you have a look at the criterion down on this line here, it's going to see, are they an I or a C donor type? If the answer is yes, it will then say, and is their donation total greater than 1,000? And is their donation total greater than 10,000? So in fact, I'm going to get anyone who is an I or a C where the donation is greater than 10,000. So anyone who is an I that's less than 10,000 but more than 1,000 won't appear. So in order to overcome that, what I have to do is I have to put the brackets the way I want it to work. And so the brackets are really like what you used to use in maths when you did an equation. We just say, okay, oh, sorry, I need to get rid of this one in here. And then I put another one around here. So first of all, what it's going to do is it's going to say, is the donation total greater than or equal to 1,000 and the donor type is equal to an I? Or is the donor type equal to C and the donation total is greater than 10,000? And if either of those is true, then it's going to output that information. So if I look now I start to get those individuals who have given more than 1,000 but less than 10,000, they're now coming back in. Okay, so it's a fairly simple way to generate that report. One of the problems is, if I suddenly say, oh, I want to make that $2,000, as soon as I change that to a 2, it's now shifted those brackets the way that it wants to do it. Now, you can turn that off. If we go to settings, this auto bracket option, you can turn that off, and then you can use this brackets option here to bracket it the way that it would do automatically for those circumstances where you do actually want it to do it. Okay, so that's a very simple report. I've done that initially using the wizard, but you don't have to use the wizard, and when we wanted to modify it, we were able to do that. I can go up the top here and go File, New, and again, I could start the wizard, but if we wanted to do something fairly similar, maybe on the donation file, I can simply click on this drop down here. Now, when we do it on the native screen, I guess you'd call this, you'll see that these first four files here are those first four that I mentioned that are the most useful ones. So they put those up the top for you just to make it a little bit easier to find. So I could do a report on the donation file. I could do the order, maybe campaign name, or I'll do it in donor number order. I'll put a criterion in here, and I'll say that I want anything from this year. I'm hoping that I've got some donations this year. So I'll say donation date greater than or equal to, and there are some things called date variables, which will probably get covered in next month's one. So I'm just going to put in the full date. And I say, yep, I want all donations in that period. And for each of those, I can output various things. Now, I'll output the donor number. Okay, donor number. I'll put the date, the campaign code, ledger code, maybe the amount, and I'll see how we go. Okay, so you can see it's searching, searching, searching. Oh, I only got 2. Okay, well, that's not good. Let me change the date then, make that 2016. Unfortunately, this is sample data. So there it is. It sort of starts to come out, and it comes out fairly quickly. Changing the order, if I did it, say, account code order, then I'm going to get my stuff. Now, all of the, well, these are all blanks. It's probably not a very good example as well. But as you can see, the data tab allows you to set up the report. The preview will show it to you, and of course you can do things like stretching these fields and moving them around, and Gary will do that sort of stuff. So I'm actually going to pass over to Gary now, who can show you some more, I guess, slightly more complex reports. Rather than just looking at one file, you can look at multiple files.
Gary, we just need you to unmute yourself.
Sorry, lawnmower man's out the front. Okay, sorry, I muted myself. So what Murray showed you was basically choosing one file, so say the donor file, and the criteria and the fields that we were selecting was basically coming from that one file. Lots of times you'll be wanting to perhaps do a report that maybe includes pledge information or donation information or things like that. And in order to do that, because the files are related, but all of the information, say on a donation, as a good example, is not stored on the donor record, they're stored in the donation records. So to give you an example of that, if I go back to donors, and I look at my fields down here, as Murray has shown you before, all of these fields, not those, so all of these fields on the donor is just to do with the donor themselves. So it's name, address, summary details, as Murray showed you, like donation total, things like that. But I can't get individual donation amounts when I'm doing that, unless I'm doing things like their last donation or second last, third last, etc. As you can see the fields there at the moment. So in order to do a report where I might be looking at individual donation amounts and want to know how much each person gave, to in a particular date range or whatever it may be, what I have to do is go via the donation file. Again, I can then choose how I want to sort them. And because the donation records have got different sort orders built into the file by default, the order that you get here will be different. If you're looking to do a report that's going to be in alphabetic order, always use the sort key. So you can use that on the donors, the pledges, the donation, etc., because the sort key is generated based on the surname and the first four initials of the first name, or based on the company name. So it'll always be in order. If perchance you're doing something on donors where you said, I want to sort the report based on the surname, if you've, say, got a business record, a company or organization that doesn't have a person's name, it just has, like the manager at this company, and you sort by the surname, you're going to get all those records at the top because the surname's blank. So sort key is normally a better one to do. So in this case, if I choose something like the donor number, donation date, and then record number. So rec number is, as Murray said, just a number the system stores, so that's the number of that record, nothing to do with the data inside it. What I can do now is go to my criteria, and just like we did on the donor file, I could say, look, by default, because I've chosen the donation file at the top here, the file that's being used for the criteria is also the donation file. But what I can do is then go here and say, what I want to do is criteria from the donor record, and you can see it's now changed the fields that I've got available. So I could then go through and say I'm looking for any of the fields, so donor type equals, and again, I could choose that. So you can see it's building the list of fields from the donor records, not the donation records. So in this case, if I said I'm just going to do a report on individuals, and now my second criteria will be based on the donation file. So I could say donation date greater than or equal. And this is where I can put in a date. So I can actually type a date in and say, 1st of July 2017 or 1st of the 1st this year, or whatever date you want to start. When you're doing dates, it's a good idea to always put the first one as greater than or equal, so that you don't say greater than the 1st of the month, because you'll miss that one day in your report. And then if you've got a stop, then you can put a second date in where it's basically less than the date you want to stop. Okay. So if you do that and you wanted everything to current from that day, then you could leave the criteria open. So if I were to say put a date like that in. So that will say I'm looking for any donation that was made by an individual where the date is greater than the 1st of the 1st this year, and that will be up till today. So if I save this report, it will always be from that date, but it'll always be to the date I run the report. So the criteria is not changing, but obviously the data will be changing all the time through. The same sort of mechanism exists then. At the bottom, I can obviously choose fields from the donation record. So I said, like Murray showed you, if we double click, I can say donor number, but then after the donor number, I don't want to show the amount straight away. I want to show the donor details. So I can now click down here where it's got select fields and pull the data from the actual donor records. So again, I could choose title, first name, surname, company, then go back to the donation. And if I sort that again, I can say the amount, campaign, whatever it is I want to put in there. Okay. So again, I can preview. And depending on how good my data is, okay, so you can see down the bottom, based on what my criteria is, it's showing me how many records are in the file. So that's how many donation records are in my donation file, because that's the report I'm selecting as the main report to do, how many it's looked at, and how many have been found. Okay, so they're saying these are the only records out of my data that match my criteria. But you can see on here, I've now got details from the donor. That's silly. Okay, so that'll have to run again, unfortunately. Okay, so it'll go through. And mine's running really slow at the moment. Not quite sure why, but normally it does go through much quicker than this. But you can see I've got the donor number because that's common in both files. So the donor number is on the donor, of course, but when we save the donation records, the donor number also saves as part of the donation, and that's what links the two things together. Okay, so from there I've then got fields like the title, first name, surname from the donor, the company, but then I've gone back to the donation records to find the amount and the campaign code. Yeah. So sometimes you'll just get the report and say, okay, that's lovely, but I want to sort this somewhat differently. I don't want to use one of the standard sorts that are there. So if we go back to the data tab and up the top right hand corner where I've selected donor number, donation date, if I click on the drop down here and said, look, what I'm looking for is I'm trying to sort this based on something else. So I want to, use like the pay method or something like that. So normally that would be part of my fields down here to output. But what I can do is then go down to create temporary index. When I do the temporary index, I can only choose fields that are on the main data file that I'm doing the report on. So in this case, I can't sort it based on fields from the donor record. I can only do it based on fields that are in the donations. And so sometimes that gets a little bit frustrating because we want to sort it slightly differently. But if, worst case, we said, look, all I want to do is get the data, put it into Excel, and then I can sort by any columns I want to because I've got those options that I can do in Excel. So in this case, if I said, look, what I'm looking for is primarily the amount. So I want to find, my highest or lowest donors, okay, and then maybe entry date or batch number or the pay method. So any of those things, you can then choose those, choose OK, and the system will then go through and create a temporary index based on what we've selected. So if I go back down here to my fields, so yes, I want to output the method. Okay. So if I preview, and we go through it again, so you can see now that's added the pay method to here. So depending on what I'm trying to do the report for would dictate what I would how I would do the index. So primarily, if I was trying to do a report that showed all the donations based on, the Visa card, MasterCard, etc., you can see at the moment I'm not getting that sort the way I want it to because the first one is a Visa, then I've got a MasterCard, then I've got Visas again, then I've got diners, then I've got gateway payments. So it's just sheer luck that the gateway ones happen to be together. But what that doesn't allow me to do is then do a count of the different pay methods and total the dollars for each of those. Yeah. So what I would have to do when I do my temporary index here, you say, what is the main thing that I want to sort by? So that would have to be the first thing that I put in the temporary index, and then I could choose other fields from there. So if I say, well, that's not working the way I want it to, I could go back down to create temporary index. And in this case, I want the pay method to be first to give me some sort of breakdown. Okay, and then the amount. Again, just click OK. The system will go through, create the temporary index. So without changing anything else on the report, we can go back and run that. And as that comes through, because it's now going to use that different sort order, I'll get the data in the way that I want it to be. Yeah. As I said, sometimes what you're trying to achieve is a little bit more difficult than that. And it's easier just to say, look, I'm just going to use this to get the raw data, and from there I'm going to put into Excel and I can sort it by anything I like. So as you can see now, it's sorting them alphabetically based on the pay method, yeah, and then the amount. So my first visa is 15, then 50, then 80. So it's just really important to get here. So lots of people, when Murray and I talk to them, we'll start doing a report and I'll just leave it here by the default, which is a record number, and that's purely an unsorted report. It won't give you anything that you can sort of do a little bit nicer things with. Yeah. So some of the things we can do as we go through is say, okay, I've got some criteria here. So I've got, my donor type, my donation date, and as Murray showed, you can then go through and start doing multiple criteria and using ands and ors between them to get, closer to the mark of what you're trying to get. Sometimes what you will put in or what we're trying to do won't be able to be achieved by one single report, because the criteria sometimes, just like when we do a selection file, sometimes the criteria clashes or is so diverse that the two fight each other and you don't actually get what you're looking for. The primary parts of the screen as we go through are the first tab, which is the data tab. So if we're not using the wizard, so when you come in, it's the data tab where we do our file, our sort order, our criteria for the report, and down the bottom here is where we can select the data that we actually want to show. So the criteria won't change and the fields won't change, so I can save a report and use it again and again and again, but the data itself will be changing, because in this case, everything that's greater than or equal to 1st of 1st, 2017 will change as I enter more donations into the system. So if I do a web import or an EDH import or something like that, then the actual transaction list is going to go up, but I don't need to keep changing the criteria unless I'm looking for something different as I go through. So you can keep adding criteria all the way through here. You can go through and say, I'm only looking for donations in a certain campaign or for a certain ledger code, which is the chart account code in the structure of the system. By default, most of these lists will sort alphabetically. As you can see here, we've got amount, bank account, bank, batch, etc. But as you go through, sometimes it's easier to say, okay, from the donor record, if I sort them based on the number, as they are here, you can see the common fields are at the top. So there's things like the first name, surname, etc., the salutations, the donor type, donor source, position, company. So most of the primary fields that we're going to use for putting in our report will also be in here. So again, anything that I've got in the report, if I said, okay, look, I've got title, first name, surname, once you start going through and you're putting things like, not in the criteria, in your fields to output, if we start putting full street addresses, so we've got, street 1, street 2, potentially street 3, suburb, state, postcode, then you run the risk of running off the page. So your report basically won't physically fit onto a page because there's just, too many fields in there. As you go through, and that does happen, if I go back to donors, sort them by the number here, so then I can go down fairly quickly. So I'm now looking for street 1, street 2, street 3, suburb, state, postcode. So as I go to preview, you can now see I've basically run off the page because the fields are longer than will physically fit on the page. The page itself by default is set up as a portrait page. So sometimes you can get away with it by, squeezing up the columns a little bit, but you can also go up the top here to File, page setup and change that to a landscape page, and also change your margins. And if we say OK, so now I can see that there's a good chance I might be able to fit most of that on the single page. Okay. So once that actually goes through and I find the data, I can sort of say, that's lovely, I can do what I like from there. Okay. If I take that criteria off, then I'll go through, find my records again, but now I'm getting all of the details. So when we get to that and said, okay, that's lovely, that's what I want to run, and I want to run this report every month. Yeah. So the options that I've got at the moment, while I'm waiting for that, so that's coming up with the data now. Okay, as Murray said, sometimes you'll get the columns where they're wider than will allow on the page. And again, if I start making these longer, of course, it's going to throw other things at the end off the page. So it's just a bit of a balancing act sometimes as to, what I want to do. Because if I say, look, my title is never going to be as long as that, and the donor number is never going to be as long as that, we can shrink some of those fields down. So if I pause the report, okay, we've got hopefully going too far. So I can move some of those down so that hopefully that will fit the data in a whole lot better without me running off the page. If you're planning on just dumping the data to a text file to use in Excel or to use for something else, then because the how it looks on the screen isn't how it's going to come out. It's going to come out with the full columns. So with my criteria, if I said this is the report that I do want to save, I can now go up the top and go to File, Save Report Format, and I can then type in a name for my report. So if I just called, okay, so normally you'd give it a much clearer name than that. It'd be, individual donors since, 1st of the 1st, 2017 or something like that. So give the report a very clear name, because what you'll potentially end up with later is, a list of reports like this. So if we don't give it a nice clear name, it's going to be very hard to find the report that you're looking for. If I save the report and close that, so I get out of Visrep, and anytime in the future I come back in and say, oh, I now want to run that report again, I can go back into Visual Reporter, do File, Open Report Format. In this case, if I sort by date modified, then I'll have my report pretty much at the top. Okay, because this one had a temporary index that we created, I can normally would say yes, because that's dictating that there was some reason I created an index to sort it based on something other than the standard. So if you just say yes, the system by default will regenerate that index, and then you're ready to run the report. Okay. So if I said, well, that's fine, I can run the report, I can get that all nice, I can use it to print out and do things like that. And the other option that I do is go to File, and then I can save report data. So if I choose that, you can see there's a couple of options there. I can save it as text, which will just be a TXT file. Because in this case, I've got the report that I've saved, if I go to any of these, so even the text file, so it's saying I'm running at the moment just from my DM train directory, and the file is going to be called webinar test.txt. And by default, it's a tab separated file. Okay, so tab we find is normally a much cleaner format to have your data in, just in case, of course, there's commas in the data, and you've got an address that might be unit 1, comma, and something like that. When I put into Excel, if I start splitting by commas, sometimes they can get a little bit thrown out by that. So tab is the default, and in here it's got to include the column names in the first line. So just like you'd have in an Excel file, you can go through, just say OK, and that will run the report. But in this case, instead of showing it on the screen, it's going to dump that out to a text file that I could then open in Excel. I could use it to do a mail merge, whatever it is I wanted to do. People that do things or use online tools like MailChimp and things like that can set up a report that, basically the rules don't change, and I don't really want to see the report, or I just want to create a text file. So one of the things we can do is, apart from me having to go into the report writer, do File, Open, find the report and open it and run it, sometimes you go, well, yeah, that's nice, but there should be an easier way. Okay, the good news is there is. Okay, so if I go exit my report, so changes, so in this case, it didn't change the report itself, it's only the data that would have changed. So I can say no. When you're on the menu, if you look at the very top here, it's got options, and one of those is add a Visrep Save Report to your user menu. So on the screen itself, you've got the two that primarily we use, the start menu and the main menu. But if I look across, I've also got a user menu. So the user menu is where I can put things that are like a shortcut for me. It doesn't necessarily have to be a report, as I'm going to show you now, but I can, do any item that's on the menu. So as I go through, even my standard reports, if I were to go, say, campaign reports and the periodic campaign results, if I said, look, this is a report I run quite often, and instead of me having to go through reports, campaign reports, etc., I just want to run it straight from my user menu. So if you right-click on the menu item, it'll come up with add periodic campaign results to your user menu. So yes. So if I then go back to the user menu, I've now got periodic campaign results. If I don't want it there anymore, just right-click and remove it. So it's pretty much as easy as that. So for things that you run quite commonly, it's very handy for that. So in this case, I want to add another Visrep report. I've got 3 there at the moment. But if I go to options, add a Visrep Save Report to my user menu, if I click on my drop down, again, if I sort them by date or whatever I need to, or just find the report, okay, so you can see there's a whole lot of reports in here. When I save the reports, at the moment, the menu is only allowing me to look in the working folder, which for most people will be DM work, but there's quite a few users that use multi-company structures, or they've got a folder that's called something different. So at the moment, it won't allow me to look up one level or down or anything like that to find the report. If I go straight down the bottom, so you can see you can end up with lots and lots of them. Okay. So you can see I've got, webinar reports, weekly donor reports, there's a whole lot. So any of those reports that I wanted, if I just go reversal report in this case, by default, it'll put reversal report, and RPF is the file extension on the visual report or report files. So just like a doc is, or a docx is for a Word document, or XLS for Excel. That's basically just the file extension. So Donman will understand that's the program. By default, it puts Visrep report and then the reversal, the name of the report. You can get rid of that bit there. Just save it. So now I've got the report on the menu, and if I click on there, when that thinks about it, okay, so you can see I haven't had to go into Visrep, do file open or anything like that. I haven't changed the criteria. Whatever my criteria was for this report is saying it's just looking for reversal batch equals nothing in this case. So it's bringing up the data fairly quickly. So from there, I could still do file, save report data, as text Excel file if I need to, or as a selection file. So depending on what I'm trying to achieve at the end of that. What we'll look at a little bit more in depth when we do the next webinar, which will be more on advanced things in Visrep, will be how I can add that to my user menu where I run it and all it does is create the actual output file. I don't see the results on the screen like I do at the moment. So if I do that, exit. So even if I've opened the report that way, if I need to make some changes to the actual report format, it's the same mechanism. It's still open the report, but I can then go through and say, okay, what I'm looking for is something different. So if I do file, open report format again, okay, say yes. Okay, so if I needed to change the criteria to be something like here where I've got the date, so there's a few things that I'll touch on quickly with dates and things like that we'll explore a little bit more in the next webinar, but sometimes I can have constants that I want to use the date for. So if I take that date out, and you'll see at the very end of the screen, the field here, it's got an F, and if I click on there, we'll show you certain formulae that I can put into a report based on dates that I can use that I don't have to change the date at all. So if I was looking for a report that was always from the 1st of July for this year, or if I'm in New Zealand, the first the financial year in New Zealand, then I don't have to change that at all. So I can then go through and say what I'm looking for is greater than or equal to F. And right down the bottom of the screen here, if I stop that pop-up, will show me that the system is interpreting F up here to be the 1st of July 2017. So whenever you put the criteria up here using one of these functions, you'll always get the interpretation of that down there. If perchance I was doing something like M, so it's always the 1st of the current month. But then as we click on here again, you can see I can start doing things like here where I can do, weeks, I can do quarters, I can do M+2, M1 minus M12, things like that. So as a simple report that quite often people ask for is something like, I want to report on the, previous month's transactions. Because the months don't always run, 28 days, some have got 28, 30, 31 days, etc. So sometimes it's a bit of a pain to sort of go through and keep changing the criteria. But if I were to do something like M minus M1, if I do minus there, not shift, okay. So M minus M1, so you can now see down the bottom that that's changed that to be the 1st of the 9th, 2017. Whereas if I just do M, it's the 1st of the current month, which is the 1st of the 10th. So if I said I want everything for last month, but because I'm now already into the current month, I want to add some criteria, and I can now say and donation date less than, and in this case M. So again, M being the 1st day of the current month. So that way I don't have to worry how many days there are in the previous month, because the criteria itself will change based on the system date. So again, there's things you can do with the report writer once you get past the basics of just, I want name and address and I want this and that. We can start doing things like this, that you can sort of build some small smarts into your report so that you can just set it up and call it, the monthly report, and whatever details are in there, because at the top of the report, when you run it, we'll have the date and everything you've run the report. Okay. So one of the other things you can do is when you get your reports and look at them and you go, well, that's lovely, I might get my data there, but it doesn't tell me too much. Okay. So one of the things we can do is go through and say, look, what I want to do is, either total a column or sum a column or things like that. And they're fairly easy to do. If I go to the design tab, choose the field I'm looking for. Okay, so in this case, if I choose method, I've got an option here to either leave it centered in the left, just aligned in the left, center, or right justified. I can change it from text to a numerical currency value if I'm doing amounts especially. From there, if I just choose method and say, look, I want to count how many items there are. Okay, so I want to count how many Visa cards, etc. in my report. And if I then go to amount, I'd say I want to total that, but in this case, I want a sum. So I want to get, the total of the dollars. Okay. And then by default, because that's amount, that's gone to currency. So we just go back, let this run through again. And next time I'll run it much quicker. I've picked up some data here that's going very slow. Okay, so once I start getting the results of my report, which we should almost have. Okay, so in this case, you can see I'm getting a total here, okay, and I'm getting a method showing 0, which means something in my criteria has changed that's impacting on the report. And in this case, it's because I've put only for the previous month, where my first criteria was from the 1st of the 1st, and I only had a low number of donations. So if that happens, it's normally the criteria that's stopping me. If I get rid of that criteria, change this back. Change that back to the date that we had originally. Preview, when that goes through, so you can see at the moment it's running through, but if I go back to data, because I'm using the method and the amount, etc., and it's a temporary index, it sort of has to troll through a little bit slower then it might do. At the moment, my connection, I'm running from a external box from my computer here, is very slow, which is why we're sort of seeing all of the things go through slowly. Okay, so now I'm getting my results. So you can now see that I'm getting the amounts for each person, what they gave to. I'm now getting the total for my report, and I'm getting, how many items there are. What we'll explore a little bit more in the next webinar is from there, I want to then, set up subtotals so I can then see, what is the total for diners, how much, how many gateway donations and how many dollars there are for gateway, MasterCard, Visa, etc. But hopefully what we've touched on today will give people a good starting point into, where the data is in Visrep and things like that, and just putting some of those fields together, because there's a whole lot more we can do with this, and it's a very useful tool. And as Murray said earlier, it's like everything, it's sort of knowing where things are and, what you can do with it to sort of explore what you're going to do with it. Because once you know, yes, I can do that, then we can, start setting things up, and you'll have save reports that you'll run quite often. Even though in Donman itself, there are quite a few reports, like preset reports, sometimes this is stuff we want to report on that just doesn't suit any of those. So fairly easy to go through and set up your own report and put your criteria in your fields and things like that. And from, the very basic report where we're just getting the details, we can do subtotals, we can do counts, other things we can do, and we'll explore a bit more in the more advanced webinar, is joining fields together, changing fonts, putting a graphic on your report, things like that, to make them much, more presentable as we go through. So anyway, I'll hand back to Marla, and we'll go through any questions we've got for today.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, a couple of questions already posted, so we do have a few moments now. If anyone else has a question, just open the question pane, or the control panel, sorry, to the right of the viewer window, type your question in the question pane and click send, and we'll read them out. So I'll go back a little bit from the first question we had was from Sharon. Are you able to give some examples of bequest reporting, or is that something for the next time?
Well, bequest reporting would be, again, just saying, okay, which file is it that I want to report on? So if I'm looking for details that are in the bequest, I'd have to choose that. Again, I could choose, the sort order. So if I choose just alphabetic in this case, so the fields that I'm using here will basically be like I did for the donations. It's primarily based on anything that's in the bequest records, so the dates, comments, any details at all, but I can also get back to the donors, okay? Or in this case, because there's bequest solicitors, I can also get to the solicitors. But for most reporting that people ask us, normally it would be from the one file back to the donor file. So if I put criteria on the bequest, I'm looking for, just valid bequests, then I can choose those details and then choose the fields that I want to show in the report from either the bequest or the donor file.
Thanks, Gary. And another question from Mary. How do you search on fields that are blank or not blank? For instance, if you want to, which donors have an email address? So you're finding the field that's not blank.
Okay, so that's a bit easier than you might think. Okay, so if I choose donors, in this case, I'm not worried about the sort order. So if I was looking for email, blank or not blank, okay, so I can do email equals and just leave it blank for everyone who doesn't have an email address, or greater than blank for people that do have an email address. Because in this case, you've got to have certain things in an email address, like you've got to have the ampersand and a .com or .net or something like that. So it's just saying, look, it's either there or it's not there. So it's not something, but any other field's sort of similar. You could go through and say, I'm looking for everyone who's never given a donation. There'd be a couple of fields that would tell you that. There'd be things like the donation total, and the donation count would be 0. But for just finding, records with a blank value, that's the easiest way.
You can also just say not equal to blank,
yep,
rather than greater than.
Yeah. So you'll get the same result pretty much.
Okay, a question from Nima. Regarding the RecNum sorting order, is it okay if we leave the sort order to RecNum? I'm saying that right? And how does that affect the results?
Well, it just means if you think of record numbers just like in an Excel sheet, you've got rows and columns, but the data that's in there doesn't actually relate to the row or column and you can move it around, etc. In this case, it can't move around so much, but primarily in the case of donor records, when you first start a new data file, you say, okay, donor 1 is record 1, and that will go through. But later on, if I get to the point of saying, look, I've now archived people, or I've merged records, or I've deleted a record because it was just a dud record, there's something wrong with an import, something. So what happens is those record numbers become available. So instead of the system just getting potentially bigger and bigger and bigger with lots of holes in the data, it will go back and use those old record numbers. So it really just means that at the end of the day, it's totally unsorted. But to the report itself would depend on what you're trying to achieve, whether that's going to impact on what you get or not.
You should still get exactly the same records being output. It's just a different order that they'll come out in.
So if you're looking for, like before when I changed the pay method so that the pay methods are grouped together, if I'm doing a report like that, then using record number, of course, won't do that sort of nice sorting for me.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gary and Murray. One more question. Actually, two more questions. One from Tina is, if there's a recording of this session to watch again, there will be. It's usually posted within a couple of days on the client portal. So take a look there in the next couple of days, it should be there. And last question from Antonia, what about comparison reports, i.e. which high value donors gave to tax 2016 but not in 2017?
Always a tough one. Because they're not stored as individual values on the donor record. Normally, the easiest way is to create two files where we can then compare the files together. So because my criteria is really saying I'm looking for people that have given to this report, to say tax 17, tax 16, or tax 15, whatever it may be, because I'm looking for people that have given to that, and then I want to compare to either find people that are in both, so they've given to both of those years, or people that gave to one that didn't give to the other. Normally, the easier way is to create a selection file, and then I can use the deduping process to, either combine them and deduplicate them, or just find out the differences between the files. That's okay. Unfortunately, it's just part of how the data's stored. Doesn't allow us to do that quite so easily.
All right, we're just coming up to time, so that's all the questions we have time for today. Thank you for participating in today's webcast and taking time out of your afternoon to join us today. As we mentioned before, we do record our webcasts and they are on our website at donman.net.au, and then click through the links from resources to recorded webcasts or directly from the client support portal where you go and log your tech support queries. You'll find the videos all there. We'll email you shortly with details of our next live webcast, which is Advanced Visrep Reporting, and that's going to be held on Tuesday the 14th of November at 2 o'clock Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. Thank you again for joining us today, and thank you, Murray and Gary, for a great presentation as always. We look forward to seeing you next month. That concludes our webcast for today. And goodbye for now.
Bye.
Bye now.